Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a place that never quite existed on any official map, yet somehow appeared in the margins of forgotten manuscripts, in the whispered recollections of monks who claimed they had dreamed it, and in the fading ink of a single parchment, known only as the lost map of the sleeping kingdom. The map itself was not large. In fact, by all accounts, it was rather ordinary in size, no bigger than a man's forearm in length, and perhaps half as wide. Yet those who claimed to have seen it would always pause before describing it, as if recalling something that resisted language. The edges were uneven, slightly burned, as though rescued from a fire that had already claimed everything else around it. The surface carried a pale, amber tone, like parchment that had aged not over decades, but over something closer to centuries of quiet neglect. At the center of this map, drawn with a steady but almost hesitant hand, lay a kingdom with no name. No banner marked it, no ruler was identified, and no borders were clearly defined. Instead, it seemed to blur gently into the surrounding lands, as though the cartographer had grown uncertain where the kingdom truly began or ended. Around it were forests that curved unnaturally, rivers that looped back on themselves, and a coastline that seemed to shift depending on how long one looked at it. But what made the map truly unsettling was not its strange geography. It was the small inscription written just beneath the unnamed kingdom. In faded ink, barely legible even when the parchment was new, were the words, "Here lies the land that does not wake." No date accompanied the map. No signature claimed its creation. It simply appeared, first recorded in the archives of a minor monastery in the late 13th century, though even that record suggests it had already been considered ancient at the time. The monks who kept it did not display it openly. Instead, it was stored in a wooden chest, wrapped in cloth, and only brought out when a new scribe was tasked with copying the monastery's more peculiar holdings. One such scribe, a man named Elias, left behind the earliest detailed account of the map. His writings, preserved in fragments, describe his first encounter with it in a tone that shifts subtly from curiosity to unease. He writes that when the chest was opened, the air itself seemed to grow heavier, as though the room had forgotten how to breathe. The other monks present said nothing. They simply watched as Elias unfolded the parchment. At first, he saw only a map, strange, yes, but not beyond the imagination of medieval cartographers, who often filled unknown regions with speculation and myth. But then, as he traced the lines with his eyes, he began to notice something peculiar. The paths did not remain still, not in any dramatic way. There was no sudden movement, no shifting ink. Rather, it was the kind of subtle change one might question in their own perception. A road that had seemed to lead east now appeared to curve north. A forest that had occupied the lower corner of the map now seemed closer to the center. Elias would blink, look away, and then look back, only to find the map slightly different once again. He wrote that he initially blamed his own fatigue. Scribes often worked long hours under dim light, and the mind, when strained, could play tricks. But the longer he studied the map, the more certain he became that the changes were not imagined. The others, when asked, offered no explanation. One older monk simply said, "It has always been like that." Elias was instructed to copy the map as faithfully as possible. This task, which might have taken a few hours under normal circumstances, stretched into days. Every time he believed he had completed a section, he would compare it to the original, only to find discrepancies. Lines that had been straight were now curved. Symbols he had carefully reproduced no longer appeared in the same place. Eventually, he began marking his own copy with notes, small annotations in the margins, questioning the shifting forms, wondering whether the map depicted a real place or something else entirely. His handwriting, initially precise, grew uneven over time, as though the act of copying the map was eroding his certainty, not only in the parchment before him, but in his own senses. It was during the fourth night of this task that Elias recorded his most troubling observation. He claimed that he fell asleep at his desk, the unfinished copy beneath his hands. When he awoke, he found himself not in the scriptorium, but standing within a vast, silent landscape. The sky above him was pale and unmoving, neither day nor night. Before him stretched a road that seemed both familiar and entirely unknown. He recognized it, though he could not explain how. It was a road from the map. In his account, he describes walking along this road, noting the absence of sound. No wind moved the trees. No birds crossed the sky. Even his own footsteps seemed muted, as though the ground itself absorbed all trace of his presence. The world felt not dead, but asleep, suspended in a state where nothing advanced and nothing decayed. After what felt like hours, though time itself seemed unreliable, Elias came upon a structure. It resembled a city, but one that had been abandoned not through ruin, but through stillness. Buildings stood intact, doors slightly ajar, as if their inhabitants had stepped out only moments before and simply never returned. He entered one of these buildings, a narrow stone house with a single wooden table at its center. Upon the table lay an object he immediately recognized. It was the map, not a copy, not a variation, but the same map he had been tasked with reproducing. The same burned edges, the same faint inscription. It rested there as though waiting for him. Elias wrote that he approached it with hesitation, a growing sense that he was no longer merely observing something strange, but participating in it. When he touched the parchment, the world around him seemed to shift, not visibly, but in a way he described as a deepening silence, as though whatever faint pulse the land possessed was fading further. He did not recall leaving the city. He did not recall returning to the monastery. His next memory, according to his account, was waking once again at his desk, the morning light filtering through the narrow windows of the scriptorium. The map lay before him, but it was no longer the same. At first glance, nothing appeared different. Yet, as he leaned closer, he noticed a small detail that had not been there before. Near the edge of the unnamed kingdom, along a road that curved toward the center, was a tiny marking, a figure, barely more than a dot, standing alone. Elias would later insist that this figure had not been present before his dream, and yet, when he asked the others, they claimed it had always been there. From that point onward, his writings take on a more fragmented tone. He continued to copy the map, though his notes suggest he no longer believed it to be a simple artifact. He began to question whether the map depicted the kingdom, or whether it was, in some way, connected to it more directly, perhaps even serving as a kind of gateway. Though he never used that exact word, what he did write repeatedly was this: "The map is not lost. It is waiting." Elias never completed his copy. His final entry ends abruptly, mid-sentence, as though interrupted. The original map remained in the monastery for several more decades, referenced occasionally in records, but never again described in such detail. Eventually, it too vanished, no note of its removal, no record of its destruction. It simply ceased to be mentioned, yet the idea of it persisted. Centuries later, scattered references began to appear in unexpected places. A traveler's journal here, a scholar's footnote there. Each account differed slightly, yet all shared certain elements: the shifting paths, the silent kingdom, and the unsettling sense that the map was not merely depicting a place, but inviting something, or perhaps someone. And so, the lost map of the sleeping kingdom became less an object and more a quiet rumor, one that lingered just at the edge of historical record. Most dismissed it as a curiosity, a relic of medieval imagination. But a few, only a few, continued to search for it, driven by a question that no record ever fully answered: if the kingdom truly existed, and if it was indeed asleep, what would happen if it ever woke? And more importantly, who or what was meant to wake it? The answer to that question would not emerge for many years. Not until the map found its way into the hands of someone who did not simply study it, but followed it. And that is where our story truly begins. The next known appearance of the map did not come from a monastery, nor from a scholar, but from the private collection of a merchant in the early 15th century, a man named Corvinhale, who dealt not in spices or silk like most traders of his time, but in objects that carried stories, strange relics, fragmented manuscripts, and items that others preferred not to keep in their homes. His records, preserved in ledgers that were never meant for public reading, suggest that he acquired the map through an exchange so vague it borders on deliberate omission, noting only that it came from a traveler who no longer required direction, a phrase that later historians would argue over endlessly, though none could quite agree on its meaning. And unlike Elias, who approached the map with with the careful discipline of a scribe. Corvin treated it at first as little more than a curiosity, something to be examined briefly, and then perhaps sold to a collector who valued the unusual. Yet, even in his earliest notes, there is a subtle shift in tone, a hesitation that grows with each mention, as though the map resisted his attempts to categorize it alongside the other objects in his possession. And he writes, in one entry dated only by the season, that the map did not seem to belong anywhere, not geographically, not historically, not even materially, because while the parchment could be held, folded and stored like any other, there was something about it that suggested it was never entirely present in the same way as the rest of his collection, as if it occupied a slightly different space, one that overlapped with the physical world but did not fully adhere to it. And this unease did not manifest immediately in any dramatic fashion, but rather in small inconsistencies that Corvin initially dismissed, such as the way the map never seemed to rest exactly where he left it, shifting just enough between observations to make him question his own memory, or the way the room felt subtly altered when the map was unrolled, the air growing still, the usual sounds of the street outside fading into something distant and indistinct. And over time, these minor details accumulated into something harder to ignore, something that began to occupy his thoughts even when he was not in the presence of the map, drawing him back to it, not out of fascination alone, but out of a growing sense that leaving it unattended was somehow a mistake. And so he began to study it more closely, tracing the lines with his fingers, comparing its shifting geography to known regions, though no alignment ever held for long. And eventually, like Elias before him, he attempted to copy it, perhaps hoping that a fixed reproduction would allow him to understand what the original resisted revealing. But the process proved just as difficult, if not more so, because Corvin lacked the disciplined patience of a trained scribe, and where Elias had approached the task with methodical care, Corvin grew frustrated, his notes filled with corrections, crossings out, and increasingly erratic annotations, questioning whether the map itself was changing, or whether he was simply failing to perceive it consistently. And it is during this period that his writings begin to include references to dreams, though he does not immediately connect them to the map, describing instead a recurring landscape of muted colors and unnatural stillness, where roads stretched endlessly without leading anywhere and structures stood abandoned, yet untouched by decay. And he notes, almost in passing at first, that these dreams felt less like imagination and more like memory, though of a place he had never visited. And as the entries progress, the connection becomes more explicit, with Corvin eventually acknowledging that the paths he walked in his sleep bore a striking resemblance to those on the map, though he hesitates to draw any firm conclusion, perhaps aware of how such a claim might be received by others, yet unable to ignore the growing overlap between the object in his possession and the experiences that now followed him beyond waking hours. And one particular entry, written in a noticeably unsteady hand, describes a moment that echoes Elias' earlier account, though with subtle differences that would later prove significant. As Corvin recounts finding himself within a city that matched no known design, its layout unfamiliar yet somehow navigable, as though he were following directions he did not consciously understand. And unlike Elias, who encountered silence as an absence, Corvin describes it as a presence, something that pressed in from all sides, not merely the lack of sound, but a kind of deliberate quiet that seemed to observe him as he moved. And within this city, he too comes upon the map, though in his case it is not resting on a table, but suspended slightly above the ground, unmoving, its surface shifting slowly as if responding to something unseen. And he writes that he did not immediately approach it, held back by a hesitation he could not fully explain, a sense that touching it again in this place would not simply mirror his waking interactions, but alter them in some irreversible way. And yet, despite this hesitation, he finds himself stepping closer, compelled not by curiosity alone, but by something that feels older, deeper, as though the map itself is not just an object he possesses, but something that has, in a way, already claimed him. And it is here that his account becomes fragmented, the sentences trailing off, the structure breaking down, leaving only the impression of an encounter that he could neither fully describe nor entirely forget. And when his writings resume in a more coherent form, he is once again awake, back in his quarters, the map rolled neatly beside him, unchanged in appearance, yet somehow different in a way he struggles to articulate. And from this point forward, his notes take on a more urgent tone, no longer the observations of a merchant cataloging an unusual item, but the reflections of someone who has begun to suspect that the map is not something to be owned or traded, but something to be followed, though he stops short of acting on this realization, at least at first, lingering instead in a state of uncertainty that stretches across several entries, each one circling the same question without ever quite answering it, until finally, in a passage that would later be cited more than any other, he writes, "It does not show the way as a map should, for it does not guide from one place to another, but from one state to another, and I begin to fear that I have already taken the first step without knowing when or how." A statement that marks a turning point not only in his writings, but in the history of the map itself, as it suggests, more clearly than any previous account, that the boundary between observer and participant had begun to dissolve, and that whatever the sleeping kingdom truly was, it was no longer confined to parchment alone, but had begun, slowly and quietly, to extend beyond it. Corvin Hale did not immediately abandon his life to follow the map, at least not in any way that would have been obvious to those around him. Because from the outside his routine appeared unchanged, his shop still opened at dawn, his ledgers still maintained with the same careful attention, and his dealings conducted with the same measured tone that had earned him a quiet reputation among those who sought objects with uncertain histories. Yet beneath this surface, something had begun to shift in a way that could not be recorded as easily as transactions or inventory, as his notes, reveal a growing detachment from the ordinary concerns that once occupied him, replaced instead by a persistent awareness of the map's presence, even when it was not unrolled before him, as though its influence no longer depended on proximity, but had settled into the rhythm of his thoughts, and he began to describe moments during the day when the world around him felt subtly misaligned, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to create a faint sense that everything he saw was only partially real, like a reflection that did not quite match the object it mirrored. And it was during these moments that he would feel an almost instinctive urge to return to the room where the map was kept, to confirm that it remained where he had left it, though each time he did, he found it exactly as expected, resting in stillness, offering no sign that it was the source of his unease. Yet this lack of change only deepened his uncertainty, because it suggested that whatever was happening was not confined to the object itself, but extended into his perception of everything else, blurring the line between cause and effect in a way that left him with no clear point of reference. And over time, this quiet distortion began to affect his interactions with others, though not in ways they could easily articulate, as customers would later recall that there was something different about him during this period, a hesitation in his speech, a tendency to pause mid-sentence, as if listening to something beyond the conversation. And while none could identify the reason, many chose to shorten their visits, sensing a discomfort they could not explain, leaving Corvin increasingly isolated within his own space, which only allowed his focus on the map to grow more intense. And it is in this isolation that his writings begin to take on a more deliberate structure, as though he is attempting to impose order on an experience that resists it, organizing his observations into patterns, noting the times at which certain sensations occur, the conditions under which the map seems most stable or most active, though even these efforts reveal inconsistencies that he cannot resolve, such as the way the map appears unchanged when observed directly, yet produces variations in his memory when recalled later, leading him to question whether the changes occur on the parchment or within his own mind, a distinction that becomes increasingly difficult to maintain, as the two seem to influence one another in subtle, recursive ways. And eventually, he begins to experiment, though cautiously at first, by altering small details in his environment while the map is unrolled, moving objects slightly out of place, marking positions with ink, attempting to determine whether the shifts he perceives are external or internal. But the results offer no clarity, as some changes persist, while others seem to reverse themselves without explanation, creating a pattern that suggests neither randomness nor consistency, but something in between, something that operates according to rules he cannot fully grasp. And it is during one such experiment, conducted late at night when the city around him had grown quiet, that he records a moment of sudden realization, not derived from observation alone, but from a convergence of impressions that had been building over time, as he notes that the map does not respond to what he does, but to what he expects, that its subtle alterations align not with his actions, but with his assumptions, as though it is shaped less by the physical world and more by the framework through which he interprets it. A conclusion that unsettles him more than any previous inconsistency, because it implies that the map is not merely changing, but interacting with him on a level that bypasses direct perception, engaging instead with the underlying structure of his thoughts. And from this point forward, his approach shifts again, moving away from attempts to control or measure the map's behavior, and toward a quieter, more attentive observation, as he begins to treat it not as an object to be studied, but as something to be listened to, though what it communicates is never described in explicit terms, only hinted at through the gradual transformation of his writing, which becomes less analytical and more reflective, filled with passages that describe not what he sees, but what he feels in its presence, a sense of depth that cannot be measured, of distance that does not correspond to space, and most notably, a growing impression that the map is incomplete, not in the sense of missing sections or damaged areas, but in the sense that it is only a partial representation of something larger, something that extends beyond its edges in ways that cannot be drawn. And this idea leads him to consider, perhaps for the first time in a fully conscious way, the possibility that the sleeping kingdom is not located somewhere in the world, but somewhere adjacent to it, existing in a state that overlaps with reality without fully entering it, and that the map, rather than guiding a traveler through physical terrain, serves as a point of alignment between these two states, allowing for brief intersections under certain conditions, a theory that he does not present as fact, but as a working assumption, one that he tests not through direct action, but through a gradual adjustment of his own awareness, attempting to match the stillness he associates with the kingdom, to quiet his thoughts, to reduce the noise of his surroundings. And in doing so, he begins to notice a change, not in the map itself, but in the way he experiences it, as the subtle distortions that once caused confusion now take on a different quality, becoming less erratic and more coherent, as though they are forming a pattern that he is only just beginning to perceive. And it is within this emerging clarity that he makes a decision, one that is not recorded as a single moment, but inferred from the shift in his entries, as he moves from observation to intention, from questioning whether the map can be followed to considering how such a path might be taken. And though he does not yet act on this intention in any outward sense, the change is unmistakable, marking the point at which his role transitions from that of a collector to something else entirely, something closer to a participant in whatever process the map represents. And it is here, at this quiet but significant threshold, that his writings pause once more, leaving the next step unrecorded, not because it did not occur, but because it would take him beyond the limits of what could be written down in the way he had before. What followed was not a sudden departure, not a dramatic moment where Corvinhale closed his shop, gathered supplies, and set out towards some distant horizon, because there was no horizon to follow. no direction that could be pointed to on any conventional map. And so his transition into whatever came next unfolded gradually, almost invisibly, marked not by movement across land, but by a quiet withdrawal from the structures that had once defined his life, as he began to reduce his dealings, turning away customers with polite but firm excuses, allowing his inventory to dwindle without replenishment, and spending longer stretches of time alone in the room where the map was kept, not always studying it directly, but simply existing in its presence, as though proximity alone was part of the process he was attempting to understand. And in his notes, which continued for some time, though with increasing irregularity, he describes a growing sense that the distinction between waking and dreaming was becoming less stable, not in a disorienting or chaotic way, but in a manner that felt strangely consistent, as if both states were beginning to follow the same underlying pattern, allowing him to recognize elements of one within the other. And he writes that the roads he once saw only in sleep now appeared in fleeting impressions during the day, not fully visible, but present enough to be acknowledged, like paths that existed just beyond the edge of sight. And rather than dismissing these moments, he began to focus on them, to hold his attention steady in those brief intervals where the familiar world seemed to soften. And through this sustained attention, the impressions grew clearer, more defined, until they resembled not fragments of imagination, but extensions of the same landscape he had previously encountered only while asleep. And it is here that his writings introduce a concept he had not articulated before, referring to what he calls alignment, a state in which his perception, the map, and the silent kingdom it depicted all seemed to converge, not perfectly, but closely enough that movement between them no longer felt impossible. And achieving this alignment required no physical action, no journey in the traditional sense, but rather a careful adjustment of awareness, a slowing of thought, a release of expectation, as though the very act of trying to reach the kingdom was what prevented its approach. And so he learned, gradually and with some difficulty, to stop seeking it directly, allowing it instead to emerge in its own time, a process that demanded patience beyond what he had previously known, yet brought with it a quiet certainty that he was moving, in some sense, closer to the threshold he had long suspected existed. And during this period, his descriptions of the city within the sleeping kingdom become more detailed, suggesting that his experiences there were no longer limited to brief, fragmented encounters, but had begun to extend into something more continuous, as he writes of walking along streets whose layout he could now recall with increasing clarity, of passing the same buildings more than once, of recognizing subtle variations in their structure that indicated not repetition, but familiarity. And most notably, he describes the presence of objects that appeared undisturbed, yet not abandoned, as though they retained some connection to those who had once used them. A chair slightly angled away from a table, a door left half open, a cup resting at the edge of a surface without ever falling, details that suggested interruption rather than absence. And this observation led him to consider, with a growing sense of unease, that the kingdom was not empty in the way he had first assumed, but occupied in a manner that did not conform to ordinary understanding, its inhabitants neither present nor gone, but suspended in the same stillness that defined the land itself. And he begins to question whether this stillness was a natural state, or the result of something that had occurred long before his arrival, something that had halted the passage of time without erasing what had already been set in motion. And though he finds no direct evidence to confirm this, the consistency of the environment, the absence of decay, alongside the absence of activity, reinforces the impression that the kingdom exists in a condition that is neither living nor dead, but something in between, a state that cannot be easily described because it does not correspond to any familiar category. And as his time within this space increases, he notes a subtle change in his own experience of it, as the initial sense of intrusion, of being an outsider in a place that did not belong to him, begins to fade, replaced by a quieter feeling of acceptance, not as though the kingdom had welcomed him, but as though it had ceased to resist his presence, allowing him to move more freely within its boundaries. And it is during one such exploration that he encounters a detail that shifts his understanding once again, as he comes upon a structure unlike the others, larger in scale, and positioned at what appears to be the center of the city, its design more intricate, its surfaces marked with patterns that resemble the shifting lines of the map itself. And though he does not immediately enter, he recognizes it with a certainty that does not require explanation, identifying it in his notes as the place from which the map is drawn, a phrase that suggests not a location depicted by the map, but the source of its existence. And this realization introduces a new question, one that he approaches with caution, because it implies that the map is not merely a representation of the kingdom, but a reflection of something within it, something that shapes both the parchment he holds in the waking world and the landscape he walks in this other state. And if that is the case, then the act of following the map is not simply a journey toward the kingdom, but a movement toward whatever lies at its center, a point that may not be a place in the conventional sense, but a condition, or perhaps even an entity, though he does not use that word, leaving the idea intentionally undefined. And as his writings continue, they become increasingly focused on this central structure, its significance growing with each entry, until it is clear that whatever comes next in his experience will involve crossing its threshold, a step he does not yet describe taking, but one that he no longer seems able to avoid, as the path that has been forming around him, slowly and without clear direction, now appears to lead unmistakably toward it, narrowing the distance between observer and participant to its smallest point yet, and setting the stage for an encounter that will likely alter not only his understanding of the map, but the nature of the sleeping kingdom itself. For a long time, Corvin Hale did not enter the structure at the center of the silent city, not because he lacked the ability, but because something within him understood that crossing its threshold would mark a point from which there would be no easy return. And so he lingered at its edges, circling it in slow, deliberate paths, observing the way its surface seemed to shift, not in form, but in meaning, as though the patterns etched into its stone were not fixed symbols, but expressions of something that changed depending on how they were perceived. And each time he approached its entrance, he felt the same quiet resistance, not a force that pushed him back, but a subtle hesitation that rose from within his own awareness, a sense that he was being given the opportunity to turn away, to remain within the outer layers of the kingdom where his presence, though unusual, did not yet disturb the balance of whatever state this place existed in. Yet, with each passing interval, if intervals could even be measured in a land where time did not progress in any familiar sense, that hesitation grew weaker, replaced by a steady pull that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition, as though the structure was not something he had discovered, but something he had always been moving toward, long before he ever unfolded the map in his waking world. And eventually, without any single moment of decision that he could later identify, he found himself standing at the entrance, not recalling the final steps that had brought him there, only the awareness that he was no longer circling, no longer observing from a distance, but present at the point where observation would give way to participation in its most complete form. And the entrance itself did not resemble a door in the traditional sense, lacking hinges or handles or any clear indication of how it might open. Yet as he stood before it, the surface seemed to recede slightly, not moving outward, but inward, creating a passage that had not been visible before, and without hesitation. Because by this point, hesitation had already been left behind, he stepped forward into the interior, where the stillness of the city gave way to something deeper, something that could not be described as silence alone, but as an absence of all distinction, a space where sound, movement, and even thought seemed to lose their usual definitions. And for a brief moment, if moments could still be counted, he experienced a disorientation, unlike anything he had known, not because he was lost, but because the very concept of location no longer applied in the way it once had, as though he had moved beyond the boundaries of a place and into something more abstract, something that existed beneath or behind the structures he had previously explored. And it is here that his account becomes more difficult to interpret, not because it lacks detail, but because the details it contains do not align with ordinary experience, as he describes encountering what he calls the convergence, a point, or perhaps a condition, where the shifting lines of the map, the silent streets of the kingdom, and his own awareness seemed to intersect completely, no longer separate elements, but aspects of a single, unified state. And within this convergence, he became aware of the map in a way that extended far beyond the physical object he had once held, perceiving it not as parchment and ink, but as a pattern that underlay the structure of the kingdom itself, a framework through which the entire landscape was organized. And more unsettling still, he began to sense that this pattern did not originate within the kingdom, but extended outward, connecting to something beyond it, something that reached into the waking world, suggesting that the map had never been a representation in the conventional sense, but a fragment of a much larger system, one that linked different states of existence in ways that could not be easily separated or defined. And as this realization took shape, he also became aware of another presence within the convergence, not visible, not audible, but unmistakably there, not as an external entity in the way one might encounter another person, but as a kind of awareness that existed alongside his own, observing in the same way he was observing. And though he could not identify it, could not assign it a form or a name, he understood instinctively that it had been part of the kingdom long before his arrival, perhaps even part of the condition that had caused the kingdom to enter its state of suspension. And this awareness did not communicate in words, yet its presence carried a kind of meaning that he could not ignore, a sense that his arrival was not accidental, that his path from the moment he first encountered the map to this point of convergence had been part of a process that was now reaching its completion. And with this understanding came a question, not spoken but felt, a question that did not ask who he was or why he had come, but what he would do next, as though the map, the kingdom, and this unseen awareness were all awaiting a response that only he could provide. And it is here that his writing slows, the sentences becoming longer, more deliberate, as though he is attempting to capture something that resists being fixed in language. And he reflects on the nature of the kingdom's stillness, considering whether it was truly a state of sleep, as the inscription had suggested, or something closer to pause, a moment held indefinitely between what had been and what might come next. And if it was a pause, then it implied the possibility of continuation, of movement resuming where it had been interrupted. Yet such a continuation would require a catalyst, something to break the equilibrium that had been maintained for so long. And in that moment, he began to understand the role he might play within this system, not as an observer or even as a traveler, but as a point of change, a presence capable of altering the state of the kingdom simply by being there, by aligning with it in a way that no one before him had done. And this realization did not bring clarity or comfort, but a quiet weight, an awareness of consequence that extended beyond his own experience, because whatever action he took or chose not to take would not remain confined to this abstract convergence, but would ripple outward through the structure of the map itself, affecting the connection between the kingdom and the waking world. And as this understanding settled into place, the stillness around him seemed to deepen further, not in resistance, but in anticipation, as though the entire system had reached a point of balance that could not be maintained indefinitely. And something, whether initiated by him or by the nature of the convergence itself, would soon shift, bringing an end to the long suspension that had defined the sleeping kingdom for as long as it had been remembered. And it is at this exact moment, poised between awareness and action, that his account breaks once more, not with a conclusion, but with an absence, leaving only the sense that whatever followed could not be recorded in the same way as everything that came before, because it did not belong to the realm of observation alone, but to something far more final. The absence that follows in Corvinhale's account is not an ending in the traditional sense, because nothing within the history of the map or the sleeping kingdom had ever followed a clear beginning or conclusion. And so what remains after that moment of convergence is not silence, but a different kind of continuity, one that must be reconstructed not from his direct words, but from the subtle traces that appeared afterward in places that had no obvious connection to him. And it is here that the story begins to widen beyond a single perspective, as records from distant regions, none of which mention Corvin by name, start to describe occurrences that bear an unmistakable resemblance to the patterns he had been documenting, suggesting that whatever took place within the structure at the center of the kingdom did not remain confined there, but extended outward, altering the relationship between the map and the world in ways that could not be easily contained or ignored. And one of the earliest such accounts comes from a coastal settlement far removed from the trade routes Corvin once frequented, where a fisherman recorded, in a logbook otherwise devoted to tides and weather, a series of unusual observations that began without warning, describing how the shoreline, which had remained unchanged for as long as anyone could remember, began to appear different depending on the time of day, not in any dramatic or destructive way, but in subtle shifts of shape and distance, as though the land itself was hesitating between multiple forms. And while others dismissed this as an effect of light or fatigue, the fisherman noted something more specific, writing that the paths leading away from the shore no longer aligned with their usual destinations, curving slightly in ways that made familiar routes feel uncertain. And though he continued to walk them out of habit, he began to experience moments where the surroundings seemed to lose their sense of progression, where moving forward did not bring him closer to where he intended to go, but instead created the impression of remaining in the same place despite the passage of time, an experience that mirrors, in a quieter form, the stillness Corvin had described within the sleeping kingdom. And this account, though isolated at first, was soon followed by others, scattered across different regions and recorded in different forms, yet all sharing a common thread, a subtle disruption in the way space and movement were perceived, not enough to cause immediate alarm, but enough to create a lingering sense that something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface of ordinary experience. And among these accounts, one in particular stands out, not because it is more detailed, but because it contains a reference that had not appeared in any record since the disappearance of the original map. As a scholar studying a collection of fragmented texts notes the sudden appearance of a diagram in the margin of a manuscript that had previously been unmarked, a diagram that, upon closer inspection, bears a striking resemblance to the central structure Corvin had described, its patterns echoing the same shifting lines, though rendered in a more simplified form, as if copied not from direct observation, but from memory or impression, and the scholar, unable to trace its origin, includes it in his notes, with a brief comment questioning whether it might be related to the long-rumored map of the unnamed kingdom, a suggestion that would have carried little weight on its own, but gains significance when considered alongside the growing number of reports describing similar distortions in perception. And gradually, without any single event marking the transition, the idea of the sleeping kingdom begins to reemerge, not as a forgotten curiosity, but as a quiet explanation for phenomena that no longer fit within conventional understanding. And yet, even as this idea spreads, it does so in a fragmented way, never fully forming into a widely accepted belief, remaining instead at the edges of scholarly discussion and personal testimony, where it can be acknowledged without requiring definitive proof. And it is within this space of partial recognition that the most intriguing development occurs, as new versions of the map begin to appear, not identical to the original described by Elias and later by Corvin, but unmistakably connected to it, each one bearing the same central absence where the kingdom should be named, the same looping rivers and shifting forests, yet differing in small but significant details, as though each map represents not a fixed image, but a variation, a momentary alignment between the waking world and the underlying pattern that defines the kingdom. And unlike the original, which seemed to resist replication, these new maps appear in multiple places at once, found in markets, tucked into books, even drawn from memory by individuals who claim never to have seen the original, suggesting that whatever change occurred within the convergence did not simply alter the map, but transformed its nature entirely, allowing it to exist not as a singular object, but as a recurring form that could manifest wherever the conditions were right. And this shift raises a question that none of the records can fully answer, though many attempt to approach it from different angles, whether the map is now spreading because the kingdom is waking, or whether the appearance of the maps is itself the process of waking, a gradual reintroduction of movement and connection into a system that had long remained still. And at the center of this question lies the figure of Corvinhale, not directly mentioned in any of these later accounts, yet present in the pattern they reveal, as the timing of these occurrences aligns too closely with the end of his writings to be dismissed as coincidence, suggesting that his role within the convergence was not merely observational, but catalytic, that whatever decision he faced in that final moment, whatever action he took or chose not to take, set in motion a process that continues to unfold long after his own story fades from direct record. And as these changes continue to ripple outward, affecting not only isolated individuals, but the broader structure of how space and direction are understood, the boundary between the waking world and the sleeping kingdom becomes increasingly difficult to define. No longer a clear separation, but a shifting threshold that can appear in unexpected places, at unexpected times, accessible not through deliberate travel, but through a kind of alignment that echoes the one Corvin had described. And it is within this evolving landscape that a new generation of observers begins to emerge. Individuals who do not encounter the map as a relic of the past, but as a present and active phenomenon, one that invites not just study, but participation, continuing the quiet, unfolding story of a kingdom that may no longer be entirely asleep. Among this new generation, there were no formal titles, no recognized order or institution that gathered them together. And yet, they shared a quiet similarity that became apparent only when their accounts were placed side by side. As each of them described a moment, not dramatic, not even particularly memorable at the time, when something in their perception shifted just enough to reveal the presence of the map, not always as a physical object, but sometimes as a pattern glimpsed in the arrangement of streets, the flow of a river, or the layout of a room, as though the underlying structure that Corvin Hale had encountered within the convergence was beginning to surface in fragments throughout the waking world. And unlike the earlier accounts, where the map was treated as something external to be studied or followed, these individuals often experienced it as something that emerged from within their own awareness, forming gradually, without clear origin, until it reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. And one such account comes from a woman named Lyris, whose writings, preserved in a series of personal journals, offer one of the most detailed perspectives from this period, as she describes how the map first appeared to her not as an image, but as a sensation, a subtle alignment between her thoughts and her surroundings that created the impression of direction without any visible path, leading her to notice patterns in places she had passed through countless times before, patterns that seemed to reorganize themselves when she focused on them, revealing connections that had not been apparent. And at first, she dismissed these impressions as coincidence, attributing them to familiarity or imagination. Yet the consistency with which they occurred gradually eroded that explanation, especially as they began to guide her in small but unmistakable ways, leading her along routes that felt both unfamiliar and inevitable, as though she were following something that had already been laid out long before she became aware of it. And over time, this sense of guidance deepened into something more structured, as the patterns she perceived began to resemble the descriptions of the lost map, though she had never seen it directly, only encountered references to it in scattered texts that offered little in the way of concrete detail. And it is this convergence of independent experience and fragmented knowledge that leads her to consider the possibility that she is not discovering something new, but reconnecting with something that has always been present, a realization that mirrors Corvin's own shift from observation to participation, though in her case it occurs without the intermediary step of possessing the map as a physical object, suggesting that the transformation initiated at the center of the sleeping kingdom has altered the way in which the map manifests, making it accessible not only through artifacts, but through perception itself. And as Lyris continues to document her experiences, she begins to describe encounters that extend beyond the patterns of place into something closer to interaction. Nodding moments where the environment seems to respond to her awareness in subtle ways, paths becoming clearer when she focuses on them, distances shortening or lengthening depending on her intention, creating the impression that the space she moves through is not fixed, but responsive, shaped in part by the same underlying structure that defines the map. And this responsiveness introduces a new layer of complexity, as it suggests that the relationship between observer and environment is no longer one-directional, but reciprocal, with each influencing the other in ways that are not immediately visible. And it is within this evolving dynamic that she begins to encounter others who share similar experiences, not through deliberate search, but through coincidence that feels increasingly less random, as their paths intersect in ways that align too precisely to be dismissed as chance. And when they compare their observations, they find both similarities and differences, confirming that while the underlying pattern is shared, its expression varies depending on the individual, creating a network of perspectives that together form a more complete picture than any single account could provide. And through these shared experiences, a tentative understanding begins to take shape, one that builds upon the fragments left behind by earlier figures like Elias and Corvin, suggesting that the sleeping kingdom is no longer a distant or isolated state, but an active layer of reality that can be accessed under certain conditions, conditions that do not require physical travel, but a specific alignment of perception, awareness, and intention. And as this understanding grows, so too does the awareness of its implications. Because if the boundary between the waking world and the kingdom is no longer fixed, then the distinction between them may eventually dissolve entirely, leading to a state where the two are no longer separate domains, but aspects of a single, continuous system, a possibility that is both intriguing and unsettling, as it raises questions about the nature of reality itself, and whether the structures that define it are as stable as they have always seemed. And within this context, the figure of Corvin Hale begins to take on a different significance, not merely as a historical participant, but as a point of transition, the moment at which the map ceased to be a static object and became a dynamic process, one that continues to unfold through the experiences of those who encounter it. And yet, despite this growing clarity, there remains a central uncertainty that none of the accounts can fully resolve, a question that lingers beneath every observation and every theory, concerning the true nature of the convergence he described, and whether it represents a beginning, an ending, or something that exists outside such distinctions, a state that cannot be fully understood from within the system it shapes. And it is this uncertainty that drives the new generation forward, not in search of definitive answers, but in pursuit of deeper alignment, each step bringing them closer to a point that may never be fully reached, yet continues to draw them onward, just as the map once drew Corvin Hale, guiding them not to a destination, but into the unfolding structure of the sleeping kingdom itself. As more individuals like Lyris began to recognize and follow these subtle patterns, what had once been a scattered collection of personal experiences slowly took on the shape of something more interconnected, though never formally organized, because there was no central authority to define it, no shared doctrine to unify it, only a quiet understanding that each participant was engaging with the same underlying structure from a different angle. And it was through these overlapping perspectives that a deeper layer of the phenomenon began to emerge, one that extended beyond movement through space and into the nature of time itself, as several accounts started to describe moments where the sequence of events seemed to loosen, where cause and effect no longer followed their usual order, allowing for experiences that felt both immediate and delayed, as though actions taken in one moment could ripple backward or forward in ways that defied ordinary explanation. And while such descriptions might have been dismissed as confusion or exaggeration in isolation, their consistency across unrelated accounts suggested that they were encountering a genuine aspect of the same system that had once held the sleeping kingdom in suspension. A system in which time, like space, was not fixed but responsive, shaped by the same patterns that governed the map. And this realization marked a significant shift in how the phenomenon was understood, because it implied that the convergence Corvin Hale had entered was not merely a point of intersection between places, but a point where the distinctions between before and after could also be altered, creating the possibility that the kingdom's long stillness had not been a simple pause, but a reconfiguration of time itself, a holding of all moments within a single, continuous present. And if that were the case, then the gradual changes now being observed might represent not the awakening of the kingdom in a linear sense, but its reintegration into a broader temporal flow, a process that would naturally produce the kind of irregularities these observers were documenting, as different layers of time adjusted to one another, sometimes aligning smoothly, sometimes overlapping in ways that created brief distortions. And among those who explored this idea more deeply was a man named Saren, whose approach differed from Lyris in that he focused less on movement and more on observation, spending long periods in stillness, allowing the patterns to reveal themselves without direct intervention. And through this method, he began to notice that certain locations exhibited stronger fluctuations than others, places where the sense of continuity would briefly weaken, allowing glimpses of alternative arrangements of the same environment, not entirely different, but subtly shifted, as though reflecting different possibilities that existed alongside the current state. And he recorded these variations with careful detail, noting how specific features would change position or form depending on the conditions under which they were observed. And over time, he identified what he described as points of resonance, areas where the alignment between the waking world and the underlying structure of the kingdom was particularly strong, making them more susceptible to these temporal and spatial overlaps And it is within these points of resonance that some of the most unusual experiences occurred, including encounters that seemed to involve other individuals not present in the immediate environment. Figures glimpsed briefly at the edge of perception, moving along paths that did not fully coincide with the observer's own, suggesting that multiple participants might be interacting with the same space from different positions within the system, their experiences intersecting only partially, like overlapping layers that never fully merge. And this idea introduced a new dimension to the phenomenon, one that expanded the concept of participation beyond the individual, hinting at a network of awareness that extended across both space and time, connecting those who engaged with the map in ways that did not require direct contact. And as this network grew, so too did the sense that it was approaching a threshold similar to the one Corvin had faced within the central structure of the kingdom, a point at which observation would once again give way to transformation, though on a broader scale, affecting not just a single participant, but the system as a whole. And this possibility brought with it a renewed sense of uncertainty, because while the gradual changes had thus far been subtle, their cumulative effect suggested that a more significant shift might be approaching, one that could alter the balance between the waking world and the kingdom in a more definitive way. And yet, despite this uncertainty, there was no clear indication of how such a shift might occur, whether it would be triggered by a specific action, a collective alignment, or simply the natural progression of the process that had been set in motion. And so those who had become aware of the patterns continued their quiet exploration, not attempting to control the outcome, but to understand it more fully, recognizing that whatever lay ahead would likely emerge not from force, but from the same subtle interplay of perception and structure that had guided the phenomenon from the beginning. And it is within this ongoing exploration that a new question begins to take shape, one that had not been explicitly asked before, concerning the role of the map itself in this evolving system, because as its presence became less tied to physical form and more integrated into perception, it raised the possibility that the map was not merely a tool or a guide, but a manifestation of the system's own self-awareness, a way in which it could be observed from within. And if that were true, then each interaction with the map, each moment of alignment, each recognition of pattern might also represent a moment in which the system became aware of itself through those who engaged with it. A feedback loop that could, over time, lead to a level of coherence or transformation that had not yet been reached. And this idea, though speculative, resonated with many of the observations being recorded, offering a framework that connected the individual experiences into a larger narrative, one that suggested the sleeping kingdom was not simply waking, but evolving, moving toward a state where the distinctions that once defined it between stillness and motion, between observer and environment, between map and territory, would no longer apply in the same way. And as this possibility continued to unfold, it became increasingly clear that the story of the lost map was far from complete, extending beyond any single account or interpretation into a process that was still actively shaping itself, drawing those who encountered it deeper into its structure, not as passive witnesses, but as integral parts of whatever it was becoming, as this sense of an unfolding system continued to deepen among those who experienced it. A quiet realization began to take hold, one that was not announced or declared, but emerged gradually through repeated encounters with the same underlying pattern, suggesting that what they were participating in was no longer simply the gradual reappearance of the sleeping kingdom, but something closer to a transformation of reality itself, not in a sudden or destructive way, but through a slow reconfiguration of how perception, space, and time related to one another. And this realization did not bring clarity so much as it introduced a new layer of complexity, because it implied that there was no longer a clear boundary between the world they had always known and the kingdom that had once existed apart from it, but rather a continuous spectrum in which both states coexisted, overlapping in ways that could only be perceived under certain conditions. And it was within this shifting landscape that a pattern began to emerge, subtle at first, but growing more defined as more accounts were compared, indicating that the moments of alignment, those brief intervals where the structure of the map became visible, were not occurring randomly, but followed a kind of rhythm, not tied to conventional measures of time, but to changes in awareness, as though the system itself responded to the collective state of those who engaged with it, strengthening when attention was focused and receding when it was not, creating a dynamic interplay that suggested a form of responsiveness beyond anything previously understood. And among those who studied this pattern most closely was a figure known only through a series of unsigned writings, whose observations introduced a perspective that differed from earlier accounts by focusing not on the external manifestations of the map, but on the internal processes that allowed those manifestations to occur, proposing that the key to understanding the phenomenon lay not in the structure of the kingdom itself, but in the way human perception interacted with it. And according to these writings, the map functioned as a kind of interface, not in the mechanical sense, but as a point of translation between different modes of awareness, allowing the mind to engage with a level of reality that normally remained inaccessible. And this engagement was not passive, but active, requiring a specific alignment of attention, intention, and openness, conditions that could not be forced, but had to be cultivated over time. And as more individuals began to experiment with this idea, they found that their experiences did indeed change depending on how they approached the map, with those who treated it as a fixed object encountering only limited, inconsistent effects, while those who allowed their perception to adapt to its shifting nature reported a greater sense of coherence, as though they were learning to move within the system rather than observe it from the outside. And this shift in approach led to a new phase in the unfolding story, one in which the focus moved away from the question of what the sleeping kingdom was, and toward the question of how it could be experienced more fully, not as a distant or abstract concept, but as an immediate and integrated aspect of reality. And it is during this phase that the first deliberate attempts were made to reach what had once been described as the convergence, not through physical travel or chance alignment, but through a sustained process of internal adjustment, a kind of disciplined attention that sought to recreate the conditions Corvin Hale had encountered, though without the guidance of a physical map or a clear understanding of what lay at the center. And these attempts met with varying degrees of success, with some reporting only brief, indistinct impressions, while others described more stable experiences that bore a strong resemblance to the accounts left by Corvin, including the sense of entering a space where the usual distinctions between self and environment began to dissolve. And within these experiences, a recurring theme began to appear, one that had not been explicitly stated in earlier records, but seemed to underlie them all, suggesting that the convergence was not a fixed location, but a state of awareness that could be reached from multiple points within the system, provided the necessary alignment was achieved. And this realization carried significant implications, because it meant that the transformation initiated within the sleeping kingdom was no longer confined to a single place or event, but had become a distributed process, accessible to anyone capable of engaging with it in the right way, effectively decentralizing what had once been a singular phenomenon. And as this understanding spread, it brought with it both a sense of possibility and a quiet unease, because while the idea of accessing such a state offered the potential for deeper insight and connection, it also raised questions about the stability of the structures that had previously defined reality, and whether they could withstand the gradual erosion of the boundaries that kept different states of existence separate. And yet, despite these concerns, the process continued, not driven by any organized effort, but by the natural curiosity of those who encountered the map in its new, more pervasive form, each individual contributing to the unfolding pattern through their own experience, creating a collective movement that had no clear direction, yet continued to progress, guided by the same subtle forces that had shaped the story from the beginning. And it is within this ongoing progression that a final, more profound shift begins to take shape, one that is not immediately visible, but can be inferred from the changing nature of the accounts themselves, as the distinction between those who observe the phenomenon and the phenomenon itself becomes increasingly difficult to maintain, suggesting that the process may be approaching a point where such distinctions are no longer meaningful, where the map, the kingdom, and the awareness that perceives them all exist as aspects of a single, unified system. And if that point is reached, then the question that once defined the entire story, whether the sleeping kingdom would ever wake, may no longer apply in the way it once did, because waking, in this new context, would not be an event that happens at a specific moment, but a continuous state of becoming, an ongoing transformation that reshapes not only the kingdom, but very framework through which it is understood, leaving behind the quiet, lingering possibility that the map was never lost at all, but was always leading toward this moment, where the act of following it becomes indistinguishable from the act of becoming part of what it reveals. By the time this deeper shift began to take hold, there was no longer any clear way to separate the story from those who were living it, because the act of observing the pattern had, over time, become part of the pattern itself, and those who once described their experiences as encounters with something external now found it increasingly difficult to define where their own awareness ended and the structure of the sleeping kingdom began, as if the boundary between observer and environment had not simply blurred, but dissolved into a continuous field of interaction. And within this field, the map no longer appeared as a distinct image or object, but as a kind of underlying order that could be sensed rather than seen, a presence that shaped the flow of perception in ways that felt both subtle and undeniable, guiding attention not through visible lines, but through shifts in meaning, where one thought would naturally lead to another. One place would open into the next, creating a seamless progression that felt less like movement and more like unfolding. And it was within this unfolding that a new understanding began to emerge, one that redefined the idea of the kingdom's long stillness, not as a state of absence or suspension, but as a necessary condition for what was now taking place, a kind of latent phase in which the system had remained unexpressed until the conditions for its emergence were met. And if this was true, then the events set in motion by Corvin Hale at the center of the convergence were not the awakening of something that had been asleep, but the activation of something that had always existed in potential, waiting for a point of alignment through which it could begin to express itself within the waking world. And this perspective, though difficult to grasp in its entirety, offered a way to reconcile the many contradictions that had appeared throughout the story, explaining how the kingdom could be both present and absent, both still and in motion, both separate from and intertwined with reality. And as this understanding spread among those who engaged with the pattern, it brought with it a subtle but profound change in how they approached their experiences, shifting from a desire to explore or uncover the kingdom as something unknown to a quieter recognition that they were participating in a process that was already unfolding, one that did not require discovery so much as awareness. And this shift in perspective altered the nature of their interactions with the system, reducing the sense of effort or intention that had once driven their exploration, and replacing it with a more receptive state in which alignment occurred not through deliberate action, but through a kind of openness that allowed the underlying structure to reveal itself more fully. And it was through this openness that some began to experience what could only be described as continuity across states, moments where the distinction between waking and dreaming, between inner and outer perception, no longer applied, creating a seamless experience in which the patterns of the map were present at all times, not as something separate to be followed, but as an integral aspect of awareness itself. And within these moments, the idea of the convergence took on a new meaning. No longer a destination or a threshold to be reached, but a condition that was always present, accessible at any point where perception aligned with the underlying structure, suggesting that what Corvin had encountered within the central structure of the kingdom was not a singular event, but an early expression of a state that was now becoming more widely accessible. And this realization carried with it a quiet sense of completion, not in the sense that the story had reached an end, but that it had fulfilled the trajectory implied from the beginning, moving from a hidden, isolated phenomenon into an integrated aspect of reality. And yet, even as this sense of completion settled in, it did not bring closure, because the process it described was not finite, but ongoing, continuing to evolve in ways that could not be fully anticipated or controlled. And within this ongoing evolution, new questions began to arise, not about the existence of the kingdom or the nature of the map, but about the implications of this integration, about what it meant for a system that had once existed in stillness to become fully active within the fabric of perception, and whether such a transformation would remain stable or continue to unfold into forms that had not yet been imagined. And while no definitive answers emerged, there was a growing sense that the story had reached a point where it could no longer be understood solely through individual accounts or isolated observations, but required a broader perspective, one that considered the system as a whole, not as a collection of separate parts, but as a unified process in which every interaction contributed to its ongoing development. And it is within this broader perspective that the final transformation begins to take shape, not as a single event, but as a gradual shift in the nature of experience itself, where the patterns that once appeared as subtle anomalies become the foundation of perception, and the distinction between the map and the territory, between the kingdom and the world, between the observer and the observed, dissolves into a single, continuous reality, one that is no longer defined by separation, but by connection. And in this state, the question of whether the sleeping kingdom has awakened becomes irrelevant, because the kingdom is no longer something that exists apart, waiting to be reached or discovered, but something that is already present, already active, already intertwined with every moment of awareness. And the map, once lost and sought after as a rare and mysterious artifact, is revealed not as an object to be found, but as a pattern that has always been there, guiding perception in ways that only now have become visible, leaving behind not a conclusion, but an open continuity, a quiet, unending unfolding that extends beyond the boundaries of any single story, including this one, into whatever comes next. At this stage of the unfolding, even the word next began to lose its usual meaning among those who still attempted to document the phenomenon, because there was no longer a clear sequence of events that could be neatly separated into before and after, and instead, what they experienced and what they recorded resembled layers of understanding that overlapped and revised one another in real time. as if each new perception slightly rewrote the structure of what had come before it, not erasing it, but reinterpreting it within a broader and more fluid framework. And this created a strange effect in the surviving journals, where earlier entries would appear consistent on their own. Yet, when read alongside later observations, seemed to hint at meanings that were not originally present, as though the act of continued engagement with the sleeping kingdom was retroactively reshaping memory itself. And among the many who noticed this, a small group of observers began to shift their focus away from attempting to map the external manifestations of the phenomenon, and instead turned inward, examining the way their own perception responded to it. And what they discovered was both subtle and unsettling, because the more attention they gave to the underlying patterns, the more those patterns seemed to integrate into the structure of thought itself, until distinguishing between observation and cognition became increasingly difficult, leading to moments where a perceived path in the environment would align so precisely with an internal expectation that it felt less like recognition and more like continuation. And in these moments, the map ceased to behave like an external guide and instead appeared as an internal architecture, shaping not only where attention moved, but how meaning was formed in the first place. And it was this realization that led to a revised interpretation of Corvinhale's final recorded insight, the one in which he described alignment not as a condition to be achieved, but as a state in which perception, structure, and intention were no longer separate processes. And this reinterpretation suggested that his experience at the convergence was not an isolated peak, but an early instance of a broader transition that was now becoming more widespread. And as this transition continued, reports began to emerge describing what could only be called shared perception states, where multiple individuals, separated by distance and circumstance, reported experiencing the same shifting arrangement of space at nearly the same time, though each described it in slightly different terms, as if the underlying structure was consistent, but filtered through individual awareness in unique ways. And this introduced a new complexity into the understanding of the system, because it implied that the sleeping kingdom was not only integrated with individual perception, but also capable of synchronizing across multiple points of awareness simultaneously, creating a distributed network of experience that did not rely on physical proximity. And within this network, certain locations became repeatedly significant, not because of any inherent physical property, but because they consistently appeared as points where alignment occurred more easily, leading observers to refer to them informally as quiet zones, places where the separation between ordinary perception and the underlying structure of the map seemed thinner, more permeable. And it was in one such quiet zone that a final, significant development was recorded by a small group of observers who had been tracking the phenomenon collectively, noting that over the course of several nights, the environment within the zone began to stabilize into a configuration that matched earlier descriptions of the sleeping kingdom with unusual precision, not as a projection or illusion, but as a persistent state that remained consistent across multiple witnesses. And within this stabilized environment, they reported a sense of continuity that differed from previous experiences. Because instead of fluctuating between different interpretations of the same space, the perception held steady, allowing them to move through it without the usual shifts or distortions. And this stability suggested that the system had reached a new phase, one in which the previously fragmented manifestations of the kingdom were beginning to consolidate, forming a more coherent structure that could be experienced collectively rather than individually. And this led to a renewed examination of Corvin Hale's original role, not as the originator of the phenomenon, but as the point at which it first became consciously accessible through deliberate engagement. And in revisiting his final writings, observers noted that his reference to convergence no longer seemed to describe a singular event confined to a specific place, but rather a condition that could be entered from multiple points, provided the necessary alignment was present, reinforcing the idea that what had begun with his experience was now expanding into a broader, distributed state of awareness. And yet, even as this expansion continued, there remained an underlying uncertainty that could not be resolved through observation alone. Because while the system appeared increasingly coherent, it also resisted full definition, as if maintaining a deliberate openness that prevented it from being reduced to a fixed interpretation. And this tension between coherence and openness became one of the defining characteristics of the later phase of the phenomenon, where each attempt to fully describe it resulted in new variations that extended beyond the scope of the previous understanding. And within this dynamic, the concept of the lost map itself underwent a final transformation in interpretation, no longer seen as a physical artifact or even a symbolic guide, but as a structural expression of the system's behavior, a way in which the underlying pattern organized itself in relation to perception, continuously adapting to the awareness of those who engaged with it. And in this sense, the map was no longer something that could be found or lost, because it was always present wherever the conditions for its recognition existed. And so the story, which had once centered on the search for a hidden kingdom, gradually shifted into something more fundamental, a recognition that the kingdom, the map, and the act of perception were all aspects of a single unfolding process, one that did not conclude in a traditional sense, but continued to evolve as long as it was observed, leaving behind not an ending, but a sustained state of engagement in which every moment of awareness became a continuation of the same quiet, shifting structure that had begun with a simple parchment and extended outward into the fabric of experience itself. At this point in the unfolding record, the idea of a final part itself had become misleading, because what followed the stabilization of the quiet zones was not a resolution, but a refinement, as though the sleeping kingdom, now no longer thought of as merely a place, had begun to settle into a more coherent relationship with the waking world, not by replacing it, but by layering itself within it in increasingly consistent ways. And those who continued to observe these changes noted that the earlier instability, the shifting impressions, and fragmented alignments were gradually giving way to patterns that felt more structured, almost deliberate in their repetition, as if the system was learning how to maintain continuity across different observers without collapsing into a single fixed interpretation. And within this phase, reports became less about sudden anomalies and more about sustained experiences, where individuals described extended periods in which the boundary between ordinary perception and the underlying map-like structure remained consistently present, not overwhelming or intrusive, but quietly integrated into their awareness, shaping how they interpreted familiar environments without fully replacing them. And this subtle integration led to a new challenge in documentation, because traditional descriptions no longer captured the full scope of what was being experienced, as language itself began to strain against the fluidity of the phenomenon, forcing observers to rely more on patterns of comparison than on precise detail. And among these patterns, one stood out repeatedly: the recurrence of certain structural motifs that mirrored the original descriptions of the lost map, including the looping rivers, the shifting forest boundaries, and the central absence where the sleeping kingdom had never been fully defined. And yet these motifs were no longer confined to any single representation, appearing instead across different forms of perception, as if they were expressions of an underlying grammar that governed how the system organized itself across both space and awareness. And it was during this phase that a new interpretation of Corvin Hale's convergence began to take hold, not as an endpoint he reached, but as a transitional condition that had since expanded outward, creating a framework within which these recurring patterns could stabilize without losing their adaptability. And this reinterpretation was supported by a growing number of accounts describing what participants referred to as continuity awareness, a state in which the sense of progression between one moment and the next became unusually fluid, allowing individuals to perceive connections between events that were not immediately sequential, but still felt causally linked within the broader structure of their experience. And this awareness did not feel like prediction or memory in the conventional sense, but rather like perceiving different sections of a single unfolding pattern simultaneously. And within this experience, the distinction between past observations, present perception, and anticipated outcomes began to blur, not in a confusing way, but in a way that suggested a deeper level of coherence underlying all three. And as more individuals described this state independently, it became increasingly difficult to dismiss it as subjective variation, especially given the consistency with which similar structural elements appeared across unrelated accounts. And this led some researchers to propose that the sleeping kingdom, in its current form, was functioning less as a dormant realm and more as a distributed cognitive system, one that interacted with human perception in order to complete its own expression, not through intention in the human sense, but through a process of mutual alignment, where awareness and structure continuously adjusted to one another, gradually converging toward a more stable configuration. And within this framework, the lost map was no longer interpreted as a guide to a hidden place, but as a dynamic interface through which this convergence could be experienced. A pattern that encoded both the structure of the kingdom and the conditions under which it could be perceived. And this reinterpretation also shed new light on the earlier accounts of Elias and Corvin, suggesting that their experiences were not isolated anomalies, but early stages in a process that was now reaching a more integrated phase. And particularly in Corvin's case, his experience at the central structure was understood as a moment where the system first achieved self-referential awareness through human perception, a point at which the map was no longer just describing the kingdom, but actively participating in its reconfiguration. And this realization reframed the entire narrative not as a search for a lost artifact, but as the gradual emergence of a shared perceptual field, one in which the boundaries between individual observers and the observed system became increasingly permeable. And as this field expanded, the phenomenon began to exhibit properties that resembled coordination, as if separate instances of awareness were beginning to align without direct communication, responding instead to shared structural conditions embedded within the environment itself. And while this did not produce uniformity, each experience remained distinct. It did create a sense of underlying coherence that became more pronounced over time, leading observers to describe the system as self-stabilizing, not in the sense that it had reached a final form, but that it was continuously adjusting toward equilibrium. And yet, despite this increasing stability, there remained an unresolved element at the core of the phenomenon, a persistent gap in understanding that no amount of observation seemed able to fully bridge, because while the structure of the sleeping kingdom and its interaction with perception could be described in detail, the reason for its initial stillness, the original condition that preceded the emergence of the map, remained unknown. And this absence of origin created a conceptual boundary that could not be crossed, suggesting that the system, no matter how integrated it became, still contained aspects that existed outside the reach of interpretation. And it is within this unresolved space that the final phase of the records begins to take shape, not as a conclusion to the phenomenon, but as an acknowledgement of its ongoing nature, where each attempt to define its limits only revealed new extensions beyond them, and where the lost map, once thought to be a key to understanding a hidden kingdom, ultimately revealed itself as part of a larger process that had no clear beginning and no identifiable end, continuing instead as a quiet, persistent unfolding within the fabric of perception itself. At this stage of the records, what remained of the original investigative impulse had almost entirely dissolved, replaced by a more observational patience that no longer sought to resolve the phenomenon of the sleeping kingdom into a single explanation, because every attempt to do so had only revealed additional layers of complexity that extended beyond the boundaries of earlier understanding. And so the focus shifted once again, not toward finding closure, but toward tracing the continuity of what was already unfolding. And it was during this period that the most remarkable consistency began to appear across all accounts, regardless of origin, geography, or individual perspective, as if the system itself had entered a phase of sustained coherence in which its expression no longer depended on isolated incidents of alignment, but maintained a steady presence within perception, subtle enough to be overlooked by those not attuned to it, yet persistent enough to be recognized by those who had previously encountered it in more fragmented forms. And this persistence manifested not as dramatic transformation, but as a quiet reorganization of everyday experience, where familiar environments retained their recognizable structure, while simultaneously revealing an additional layer of relational meaning, as though every object, path, and space was now part of a larger arrangement that could be sensed without being explicitly seen. And within this arrangement, the idea of the map itself underwent one final conceptual shift, no longer interpreted as a representation of the sleeping kingdom, nor even as an interface between perception and structure, but as a living pattern of continuity that expressed the relationship between awareness and form, adapting dynamically to the conditions under which it was observed. And this interpretation was supported by a series of accounts describing how the map appeared differently depending on the state of attention applied to it, not changing arbitrarily, but revealing different aspects of the same underlying structure, as if it contained multiple layers of organization that could only be accessed through varying degrees of perceptual alignment. And among these layers, one recurring element drew particular attention: the consistent presence of a central absence, the same unnamed region that had appeared in the earliest descriptions, which now seemed to function not as a missing piece, but as a stabilizing point around which the rest of the structure organized itself, suggesting that the sleeping kingdom was defined not by what it contained, but by what it refrained from defining. And this realization led to a renewed examination of Corvinhale's final recorded insights, which, when viewed in light of these later developments, appeared less like fragmented observations and more like early descriptions of a system that had not yet fully expressed itself, particularly his reference to convergence, which now seemed to describe not a location or event, but a structural condition in which multiple layers of perception aligned sufficiently to reveal the underlying continuity of the system. And as this interpretation gained traction among those still engaged with the phenomenon, it became increasingly clear that the role of individual observers had shifted as well, from passive witnesses or active participants into something closer to localized expressions of a broader perceptual network, each contributing to the overall coherence of the system through their own experience, without requiring coordination or shared intention. And this distributed quality gave rise to a new way of describing the phenomenon, in which the sleeping kingdom was understood not as a separate realm entering the waking world, but as an emergent property of perception itself when certain structural conditions were met. Conditions that could arise spontaneously in different contexts, explaining the recurring reports from unrelated individuals who had no prior knowledge of the map or its history, yet described experiences that aligned with its patterns. And it was within this expanding framework that the final phase of recorded observations took shape, characterized not by discovery or revelation, but by a gradual normalization of what had once been considered extraordinary, as the distinctions between map, kingdom, and perception became less pronounced, and the experience of alignment became increasingly integrated into ordinary awareness for those sensitive to it, leading to a situation where the phenomenon no longer presented itself as something separate to be studied, but as a background structure that subtly influenced interpretation itself. And in this state, the question of whether the sleeping kingdom was waking or remaining asleep lost its original significance, because both terms implied a separation that no longer applied within the observed system, which now appeared to function as a continuous field of awareness and structure, constantly adjusting, continuously unfolding, and maintaining coherence through the very act of being perceived. And while no definitive conclusion emerged from these observations, there was a shared recognition among those who documented them that the lost map had fulfilled its most consistent role, not as a guide to a hidden destination, but as a mechanism through which a hidden continuity became perceptible, revealing that what had once been described as a kingdom was never isolated in space or time, but embedded within the fabric of perception itself. And as this understanding stabilized, the need for further documentation gradually diminished, not because the phenomenon had ended, but because it had become indistinguishable from the conditions under which it was being observed, leaving behind a final impression that the true nature of the sleeping kingdom was not to be found in any single account, but in the ongoing act of noticing the patterns that quietly persist beneath the surface of ordinary experience, continuing without interruption, without beginning, and without an identifiable end, at the point where written records begin to thin out rather than conclude. The idea of continuation itself becomes the only stable reference left, because everything else, names, places, even the distinction between observer and observed, has already been absorbed into the same continuous structure that the lost map once hinted at in its earliest surviving descriptions. And what remains in the final collection of accounts is not a new discovery, but a gradual settling of perception into a form that no longer requires explanation in the way earlier generations attempted. And yet, This settling is not an ending, but a transformation in how experience is held, as if the system that had once been described as the sleeping kingdom has reached a phase where its presence is no longer marked by disruption or anomaly, but by consistency, so subtle that it blends seamlessly into the background of ordinary awareness. And those who continue to notice it do so not because it stands apart, but because it aligns so precisely with the structure of attention itself that it can only be recognized through careful awareness of small, almost imperceptible correspondences between thought and environment. And in these final accounts, there is a repeated emphasis on this correspondence, not as something that occurs occasionally, but as something that has become increasingly stable, suggesting that the earlier fluctuations, the shifting landscapes, and unstable paths described in the earliest encounters were not the final form of the phenomenon, but an initial phase of adjustment through which the system gradually integrated itself into perceptual reality. And within this stabilized phase, the map no longer appears as an object that can be found or interpreted in isolation, but as a relational structure that becomes visible only through interaction, where each moment of attention reveals a slightly different aspect of the same underlying continuity. And this continuity is described not as linear or directional, but as layered, where multiple states of experience coexist without conflict, each accessible depending on the orientation of perception. And in this way, the sleeping kingdom is no longer understood as a place that exists separately from the world, nor even as a parallel domain, but as a persistent configuration within perception that can be entered without movement, accessed without travel, and recognized without discovery in the conventional sense. And this realization, once reached, appears to remove the need for further pursuit, not because the phenomenon has ended, but because pursuit itself becomes indistinguishable from participation, and participation from awareness, and awareness from the structure it perceives, creating a closed loop that sustains itself without external reference. And it is within this loop that the final reinterpretation of Corvin Hale's role emerges, not as the initiator of a chain of events, but as the first recorded instance in which the system became consciously aware of its own accessibility through human perception, marking a shift that allowed the map to transition from a static artifact into a responsive structure, capable of adapting to the conditions under which it was observed. And this responsiveness is reflected in later accounts that describe the map as no longer fixed in form, but variable in expression, appearing differently depending on the state of awareness of the observer, sometimes as a literal parchment, sometimes as a spatial pattern within the environment, and sometimes as an internal sense of alignment that does not require external representation at all. And this variability does not indicate instability, but rather a deeper coherence that operates across multiple modes of perception simultaneously, allowing the same underlying structure to manifest in different forms without losing its identity. And it is this multi-layered consistency that leads some of the final observers to propose that what was once called the lost map was never an isolated object, but a persistent pattern embedded within the relationship between consciousness and structure. A pattern that becomes visible whenever perception aligns in a particular way. And in this sense, the act of finding the map was never about locating something external, but about entering a state in which the underlying continuity of experience becomes directly perceptible. And as this understanding becomes more widespread among those still aware of the phenomenon, the urgency that once defined earlier exploration begins to fade, replaced by a quieter recognition that there is nothing separate to resolve, because the system does not point toward a destination beyond itself, but continuously expresses itself through the very act of being experienced. And so the final records do not describe a conclusion in the traditional sense, but a gradual dissolution of the need for conclusions altogether, where the sleeping kingdom, the map, and the observers who once sought them are no longer treated as distinct elements of a story, but as aspects of a single ongoing process that continues without interruption. And in this final perspective, even the idea of waking loses its original meaning, because there is no longer a contrast between sleep and awakening that can be maintained. Only varying degrees of alignment within a continuous field of awareness that has always been present, and which, according to the last surviving note attributed to no specific author, does not end where it is found, because it was never separate from the act of finding in the first place. At the final stage of the surviving material, what becomes most striking is not any new discovery about the sleeping kingdom or the lost map, but the way in which even the act of recording begins to change its character, as if documentation itself is gradually being absorbed into the same structure it once tried to describe. And in the last scattered journals, this shift is evident not through dramatic statements, but through subtle alterations in tone and emphasis, where earlier entries once focused on observation and interpretation now give way to descriptions that feel more immediate, more present tense, even when referring to experiences that appear to extend beyond ordinary continuity. And it is within this altered mode of recording that a final pattern begins to emerge, one that no longer concerns the map as an object or the kingdom as a location, but rather the persistence of alignment as a condition of awareness. And this alignment is described not as something achieved through effort, but as something recognized when it is already present, suggesting that what earlier generations interpreted as a journey toward understanding was in fact a gradual adjustment of perception to an underlying structure that had always been there. And in these final reflections, the sleeping kingdom is no longer framed as a separate realm entering the world, but as a consistent layer of relational order that becomes visible whenever perception settles into a particular configuration. And this configuration is not fixed or uniform, but adaptable, responding to the orientation of attention without losing coherence, allowing different individuals to experience the same underlying pattern in different forms, while still recognizing it as the same phenomenon. And it is this adaptability that ultimately dissolves the need for a single authoritative description, because no one account can fully contain a structure that expresses itself differently across each point of engagement. And so the final records do not attempt to unify the phenomenon into a single definition, but instead describe its consistency through variation, emphasizing the way it maintains continuity even as its appearance shifts. And within this continuity, the role of Corvin Hale is revisited one last time, not as a central figure in a linear narrative, but as an early instance of sustained alignment, whose experience at the convergence is now understood as the moment when the system first stabilized enough to be perceived across multiple layers of awareness simultaneously. And this stabilization is what allowed later experiences to unfold with increasing coherence, as if the structure he encountered had gradually extended itself outward, integrating additional observers into its framework without requiring direct transmission or instruction. This idea is supported by accounts that describe similar experiences occurring independently in different regions, often without any knowledge of the map or its history, yet producing descriptions that align closely with earlier patterns, suggesting that the phenomenon does not depend on continuity of information, but on continuity of structure, which can manifest wherever the necessary conditions of perception are met. And this leads to the final conceptual shift in the surviving material, where the lost map is no longer interpreted as a guide, nor even as a representation, but as a relational interface through which the underlying structure of the sleeping kingdom becomes perceptible. And this interface is not static, but responsive, adapting to the conditions under which it is encountered, sometimes appearing as a spatial diagram, sometimes as a sense of directional clarity, and sometimes as an internal recognition that does not require external form at all. And across all these variations, what remains consistent is the presence of a central absence, a feature that continues to appear in every version of the map, regardless of medium or observer. And this absence is no longer understood as a missing element, but as a stabilizing condition that allows the rest of the structure to maintain coherence, functioning less as a void and more as an organizing principle around which the rest of the pattern resolves. And it is this realization that leads the final observers to conclude that the sleeping kingdom was never defined by what it contained, but by the relationship between what is perceived and what is left undefined, creating a dynamic equilibrium that sustains the entire system. And within this equilibrium, the distinction between waking and sleeping becomes increasingly irrelevant, because both states are now understood as variations within the same continuous field of awareness, differing only in degree of alignment rather than in fundamental nature. And as this understanding settles into the final records, the urgency that once characterized the search for the map gradually disappears, replaced by a quiet recognition that nothing is missing that was ever separate, and that the process, which began with a single parchment in a forgotten archive, has unfolded into a sustained condition of perception that no longer requires explanation to function, because it is already being experienced in the act of noticing itself. And so the final entry, attributed only to an unknown observer and found without context or origin, does not attempt to summarize or conclude, but simply states that the map was never lost, only unrecognized, and what it reveals does not end, because it is the structure through which endings are understood, leaving the story not closed, but quietly continuous, extending beyond the limits of the written record into whatever form perception takes next. After the last anonymous note, the archive does something unusual that no earlier generation of scribes would have expected. It stops behaving like an archive in the strict sense and begins behaving more like a field of repetition, where older fragments reappear in altered form without any clear act of copying, as if the very act of being remembered by successive readers is enough to reshape their structure. And this is most clearly seen in the way descriptions of the sleeping kingdom begin to reemerge in unrelated documents that were never originally part of the collection, appearing instead in merchant ledgers, travel notes, and even personal correspondence that has no obvious connection to the earlier investigations, yet still carries the same structural motifs: the looping geography, the unnamed center, and the recurring sense of stillness that is not absence, but suspension. And among these later appearances, one pattern becomes increasingly dominant: the idea that the kingdom is no longer something that can be located in any external direction, but rather something that organizes perception from within. And this shift is not presented as theory in most of the accounts, but as an unavoidable conclusion drawn from repeated experience, because those who encounter it describe a similar progression, beginning with subtle inconsistencies in familiar environments, followed by a gradual recognition of underlying structure, and eventually a phase where the distinction between environment and interpretation becomes difficult to maintain. And it is within this phase that the lost map ceases to function as a separate reference point, because it is no longer needed as a tool of orientation, instead becoming indistinguishable from the act of perception itself. And in some accounts, this is described very simply, as if direction has stopped being something external and has become something inherent to awareness, while in others it is expressed more cautiously, suggesting that what was once interpreted as a map was actually a pattern of attention that reveals itself differently depending on the observer's state of alignment. And this divergence in description does not weaken the overall consistency of the phenomenon, but rather reinforces its adaptability, because it shows that the same underlying structure can be approached through different conceptual frameworks without losing coherence. And as this understanding spreads through the scattered remnants of documentation, a final reinterpretation begins to form, not as an official doctrine, but as a shared tendency among those who have had prolonged exposure to the phenomenon, that the sleeping kingdom was never a place waiting to be discovered, but a condition that becomes visible whenever perception organizes itself in a particular way. And this condition is not stable in the conventional sense, but continuously responsive, meaning that it can appear and recede without any change in external circumstances, depending solely on the configuration of awareness. And this is where the final connection to Corvinhale's experience becomes most significant, because his convergence is now understood not as a singular entry point into a hidden realm, but as the moment when perception first fully synchronized with that underlying configuration, allowing the structure to be recognized as a whole rather than in fragments. And from that moment onward, what followed was not expansion in a physical sense, but repetition of alignment across different observers, each encountering the same structure through their own perceptual conditions. And this is why later reports, despite their separation in time and place, continue to produce remarkably similar descriptions, even when the individuals involved have no knowledge of the earlier material, suggesting that the phenomenon is not transmitted through communication, but through conditions that can independently arise. And within this framework, the map itself is reinterpreted one final time, no longer as an artifact or even as a dynamic interface, but as a stable pattern of relational awareness that becomes visible whenever perception reaches a certain threshold of coherence. And this threshold is not fixed or measurable, but emergent, meaning that it cannot be forced or permanently maintained, only recognized when it appears. And this explains why all attempts to preserve or replicate the map in physical form ultimately fail to capture its full behavior, because what is being preserved is only the surface expression of a deeper process that exists within perception itself. And as this realization becomes more widely accepted among the final observers, the need to continue documenting the phenomenon gradually diminishes, not because it has ended, but because it no longer presents itself as something external that requires explanation, instead becoming a background structure that is continuously present, but only occasionally recognized. And in this final state of understanding, the sleeping kingdom is no longer described as waking or sleeping, because both terms assume a separation that no longer applies, and instead it is understood as an ongoing condition of relational stability within perception, where what was once called the lost map is simply one of many expressions of the same underlying pattern. And the story that began with a single parchment in a monastery ends not with disappearance or resolution, but with a quiet recognition that nothing was ever truly lost, only gradually understood as part of a system that was always present, always active, and always unfolding through the very act of being seen. By the time the last layer of interpretation settles among the remaining observers, the entire idea of recording has changed so fundamentally that even the word feels slightly out of place, because what they are dealing with is no longer something that can be separated into subject and description. And instead, what remains is a continuous process in which perception, structure, and meaning are all participating in the same unfolding state. And in this final phase, there are very few new accounts in the traditional sense, only refinements of earlier understandings that appear again and again in slightly different forms, as if the system itself is circling the same configuration from multiple angles to stabilize its expression across awareness. And one of the most consistent observations in this stage is the way familiar environments begin to feel increasingly complete, not in the sense that anything has been added or removed, but in the sense that nothing feels arbitrary anymore, as though every element is part of a larger relational structure that can be sensed even without conscious attention. And this leads to a subtle but important shift in how individuals describe their experience. Because instead of focusing on anomalies or distortions, they begin to describe continuity, a sense that what they are perceiving has always been connected in ways they are only now able to recognize. And within this continuity, the lost map is no longer treated as a separate artifact or even as a conceptual tool, but as a persistent pattern that reveals itself whenever perception aligns in a particular way. And this alignment is no longer described as effortful or rare, but as something that can arise naturally under certain conditions of attention, especially when the mind is not actively trying to impose structure, but instead allows structure to become visible on its own terms. And it is in this receptive state that many of the final observations occur, where individuals report moments of quiet clarity in which the distinction between inner thought and external environment seems to soften just enough to reveal a shared underlying order. And this order is not static, but responsive, adjusting itself subtly depending on how it is perceived, not in a reactive sense, but in a way that suggests mutual dependence between awareness and structure. And it is here that the reinterpretation of Corvinhale's convergence reaches its most stable form, because in retrospect, it is no longer seen as an isolated event that triggered a chain of consequences, but as the first documented instance of sustained coherence between perception and the underlying pattern that would later be recognized as the sleeping kingdom in its integrated form. And this sustained coherence is what allowed later observers to encounter the same structure independently, even without knowledge of the original map, suggesting that what is being experienced is not transmission, but recurrence, a pattern that emerges wherever the conditions of alignment are met. And this understanding also reframes the earlier fragmentation of accounts, because what once appeared as inconsistency is now understood as variation within a stable system, where different observers access the same structure through different perceptual pathways, resulting in descriptions that differ in surface detail, but remain consistent in underlying form. And this is why references to looping geography, central absence, and shifting boundaries continue to appear across all stages of documentation, even when separated by centuries and context, because these are not features of a single place, but expressions of a structural relationship that persists across all instances of alignment. And in this final interpretation, the sleeping kingdom is no longer described as a hidden realm or a dormant land, but as a mode of organization within perception itself, one that becomes visible whenever awareness and structure enter into a stable relationship. And this relationship is not permanent or exclusive, but intermittent and distributed, meaning that it can arise in different places and times without requiring continuity of physical contact. And it is within this framework that the idea of waking is finally set aside, because waking implies a transition from one state to another, whereas what is being described here does not involve transition in that sense, but rather recognition of a condition that has always been present, but not always perceived. And so the final accounts do not describe an ending or a resolution, but a gradual fading of the need for distinction between map and territory, between observer and observed, and between the sleeping kingdom and the world in which it was once thought to exist separately. And what remains is a quiet acknowledgement that all of these terms were different ways of describing the same continuous structure, a structure that does not conclude because it was never confined to a beginning, and which continues not as a story in the traditional sense, but as an ongoing condition of relational awareness, present wherever it is recognized, and absent only in the sense that it does not demand recognition in order to exist, in what can only be described as the final residue of the archive. There are no longer new witnesses in the traditional sense, only echoes of earlier recognition reappearing in increasingly simplified forms, as if the system has reached a point where it no longer needs complexity to express itself, and instead relies on minimal variations of the same underlying structure to remain perceptible. And these late-stage accounts are striking not for what they add, but for what they consistently omit, because references to specific individuals, locations, and even chronological order begin to disappear almost entirely, replaced by descriptions that focus solely on states of awareness and patterns of relation, suggesting that the phenomenon has fully detached from narrative dependency and now exists as a self-sustaining configuration within perception itself. And in this configuration, the lost map is no longer mentioned as a separate entity at all, not because it has been dismissed or forgotten, but because it has become indistinguishable from the conditions under which it was previously identified, meaning that the act of perceiving structure and the structure being perceived are now understood as the same process. And within this understanding, the sleeping kingdom ceases to function as a defined concept, instead becoming a term of convenience, used only when attempting to describe a particular quality of coherence within experience. And this coherence is consistently described in the final fragments as a sense of alignment that does not require movement or search, but arises when attention is no longer fragmented by the expectation of separation. And it is in this state that the earlier distinctions between map, kingdom, and observer collapse entirely, leaving behind only a continuous field of relational awareness in which differences are still perceptible, but no longer fundamental. And this shift is reflected in the language of the final entries, which become increasingly abstract, yet paradoxically more stable, as if precision is no longer derived from detail, but from the consistency of the underlying pattern being expressed. And one of the most repeated observations in this phase is the absence of interruption, meaning that what was once experienced as transitions between states is now experienced as uninterrupted continuity, where even apparent changes are understood as variations within a single ongoing structure. And this leads to a final reinterpretation of Corvin Hale's convergence, which is no longer viewed as an entry point or a historical moment, but as the first sustained instance of this uninterrupted continuity becoming consciously perceptible through human awareness. And from this perspective, all subsequent experiences are not separate developments, but reiterations of the same alignment occurring under different conditions. And this explains why the phenomenon appears both distributed and consistent, because it is not being transmitted across space or time, but is instead being recognized wherever perception temporarily stabilizes into a compatible configuration. And this recognition does not produce uniform experience, but rather consistent relational structure expressed through diverse forms. And this is why the accounts remain varied while still describing the same underlying reality, because variation is not contradiction in this system, but a necessary expression of adaptability, allowing the same pattern to persist across different modes of awareness without becoming fixed or exhausted. And in the final reflections attributed to no identifiable source, there is a repeated emphasis on the idea that nothing has ever been separate from this structure, and that separation itself was only ever a temporary mode of perception that allowed the pattern to be noticed as something distinct before being reabsorbed into continuity. And this leads to the final conceptual dissolution of the idea of finding the map, because finding implies an external object to be located, whereas what is being described is now understood as a shift in recognition, where the map was never absent, but simply unrecognized as the structure of relational awareness itself. And once this recognition stabilizes, the distinction between discovery and experience collapses entirely, leaving only the ongoing presence of the same coherent field, which does not require validation, preservation, or conclusion, because it is not a result of the story, but the condition in which any story becomes possible. And in this final understanding, the sleeping kingdom is neither awakened nor asleep, because both states depend on separation that no longer applies, and instead it is described only as a continuous mode of being perceived, always present, always responsive, and always complete in each moment it is recognized, which is why the final surviving fragment does not end with explanation or closure, but with a single line that simply states that what was once called lost was never outside perception at all, only waiting for perception to become capable of recognizing itself within it. And after that, there is nothing further to add, not because the record is incomplete, but because completeness has already been reached in the only form it was ever capable of taking. At this penultimate stage of the surviving continuum, the tone of all remaining records changes once more, not in content, but in necessity, as if the act of explaining has become optional rather than required, and what was once a structured attempt to understand the sleeping kingdom and the lost map now exists as a kind of residual awareness that no longer depends on formal articulation to persist. And this shift is reflected in the way the final observers describe their experiences, because they no longer begin with context or background, but instead with immediate perception, as though continuity has replaced explanation as the default mode of understanding. And within this continuity, the most consistent observation is the disappearance of interpretive distance, meaning that what is seen and what is understood no longer occur as separate steps, but as a single unified event. And this is described repeatedly across different accounts in slightly varied language, sometimes as clarity without reflection, sometimes as recognition without delay, and sometimes simply as the absence of separation between noticing and knowing. And although these descriptions differ in form, they converge on the same underlying condition, which is that perception no longer requires translation to become meaningful. And it is within this condition that references to the lost map become increasingly rare, not because it has ceased to be relevant, but because it has ceased to be distinguishable from the structure of perception itself. And this is where the earlier idea of alignment reaches its final articulation, no longer described as a process of adjustment or calibration, but as a stable state in which awareness and structure are already coherent without effort. And in this state, the sleeping kingdom is no longer perceived as a separate domain or hidden layer, but as a persistent mode of relational organization that underlies all experience. And this realization is not presented as discovery, but as recognition of something that has always been present, but not always explicitly noticed. And it is in this context that Corvin Hale's convergence is revisited one final time, not as a historical moment, but as a threshold condition that marked the first sustained stabilization of this relational awareness within a human perceptual framework. And from that point onward, all subsequent experiences are understood as variations in the degree of access to the same underlying structure, rather than separate encounters with a distinct phenomenon. And this reinterpretation allows earlier contradictions in the records to resolve naturally, because inconsistencies are no longer seen as errors, but as reflections of different points of entry into the same continuous system. And this system is described in the final fragments as self-referential, meaning that it does not exist independently of being perceived, nor does perception exist independently of it, but both arise together as expressions of the same ongoing process. And within this process, the idea of the map transforms for the last time, no longer functioning as a guide or representation, but as a transient configuration of awareness that becomes visible whenever relational coherence reaches a certain threshold, and disappears when that coherence shifts, not because it is lost, but because it is no longer differentiated from the background of perception. And this explains why no stable physical version of the map can ever be maintained across time. Because what is being preserved is not an object, but a condition, and conditions cannot be fixed without altering the system that produces them. And as this understanding becomes implicit in the final records, the need for explicit explanation diminishes further, until what remains is a series of observations that resemble commentary on a process already fully integrated into perception. And in these observations, the sleeping kingdom is consistently described as neither approaching nor receding, neither awakening nor remaining dormant, but maintaining a continuous state of relational presence that adapts fluidly to the awareness that engages with it. And this adaptability is no longer seen as instability, but as the defining characteristic of a system that exists through interaction rather than isolation. And it is within this framework that the final surviving interpretation of the entire phenomenon emerges, suggesting that what was once understood as a journey toward a lost kingdom was in fact a gradual refinement of perceptual capacity, through which the structure underlying experience became increasingly visible as attention stabilized. And this refinement does not end at a final point, but reaches a state of equilibrium in which further refinement is no longer distinguishable from continuation. And so the distinction between progression and completion dissolves entirely, leaving only sustained coherence as the remaining descriptor of the system. And in this sustained coherence, the earlier role of Corvin Hale is understood as foundational, not because he initiated the phenomenon, but because his experience provided the first recorded instance in which this coherence was recognized as such, creating a reference point through which later observations could be contextualized. And yet, even this reference point becomes less important over time, because the system no longer relies on origin to maintain structure, and instead maintains itself through ongoing relational expression, which is why the final accounts do not attempt to identify a beginning or an end, but instead focus on the continuity that persists regardless of interpretation. And this continuity is described as the only constant across all variations of experience, whether individual or collective, whether early or late, whether fragmented or stabilized. And in this sense, the entire archive can be understood not as a record of discovery, but as a progressive recognition of something that was always already present, waiting not to be found, but to be recognized as the condition under which finding itself becomes meaningful. And this recognition marks the final conceptual stage before closure, not as an ending, but as a transition into a mode of understanding where closure is no longer required. In the final surviving segment of the entire record, there is a noticeable absence of any attempt to frame what follows as an ending, because even the concept of final has lost its earlier rigidity and instead functions only as a convenience for those who still require sequence to make sense of continuity. And in this last layer of observation, the sleeping kingdom, the lost map, and all associated accounts are no longer treated as separate threads of inquiry, but as expressions of a single, unified condition that persists regardless of whether it is actively perceived. And this condition is described in increasingly simple terms, not because understanding has diminished, but because complexity is no longer necessary to describe what is already fully integrated into experience. And so the language itself becomes minimal, almost transparent, as if it is attempting to avoid interfering with the structure it is describing. And within this simplicity, the most consistent observation is that nothing new is being added and nothing is being removed. Yet everything continues to remain present in a way that feels complete without requiring closure. And this sense of completion is not static, but ongoing, as if each moment of awareness is sufficient to contain the entirety of what the system represents. And in this final articulation, the lost map is no longer referenced even as a metaphor, because it has fully dissolved into the conditions of perception that once gave rise to it as an identifiable object. And what remains instead is a recognition that structure and awareness are not interacting elements, but aspects of a single relational field that expresses itself differently depending on how it is engaged. And this field is described not as expanding or contracting, but as continuously maintaining itself through the act of being perceived, which means that observation is no longer a passive act, but a sustaining condition of coherence. And within this understanding, the sleeping kingdom is no longer considered a domain that can be entered or exited, but a mode of relational stability that becomes apparent whenever perception aligns with its inherent structure. And this alignment is not something that occurs in stages or through progression, but as a natural consequence of attention no longer resisting the patterns it encounters. And as this realization settles into the final fragments of the archive, the role of Corvin Hale is reduced to a single point of reference rather than a narrative center, because his convergence is now understood as the first documented stabilization of this relational field within human awareness, marking not the beginning of the phenomenon, but the beginning of its recognition. And from that point onward, all subsequent experiences are understood as variations in how this stabilization is perceived, rather than separate developments in a linear sequence. And this perspective resolves many of the contradictions that appeared in earlier accounts, because differences in description are no longer interpreted as inconsistencies, but as reflections of how a single structure can manifest differently depending on the conditions of awareness. And this leads to the final synthesis present in the record, which states in increasingly minimal form that the sleeping kingdom was never located in any external direction, nor confined to any specific artifact, but was instead the persistent relational condition through which perception organizes itself into meaningful continuity. And in this condition, the distinction between waking and sleeping is no longer relevant, because both are simply variations within the same uninterrupted field of awareness. And the map, once thought to guide movement between places, is revealed to have always functioned as a temporary expression of this field when it becomes visible to itself, and therefore cannot be lost, because it was never separate from the conditions under which loss is defined. And in the final lines attributed to no identifiable author, the record concludes not with closure, but with dissolution of necessity, stating only that what was once sought has always been the structure of seeking itself, and what was once called the sleeping kingdom is simply what remains when perception no longer divides itself from what it perceives. And after this statement, there is no continuation, not because the account has ended, but because continuation itself is no longer distinguishable from presence.